World War I has been remembered for its endless mud, the roar of artillery, and the sheer weight of death that hung over every field. But for the men who lived it, the story was far stranger than any history book dares to admit. Imagine being 19, stepping down into a trench for the first time, the ground swallowing your boots in a thick sludge that smelled of rot and waste. The walls press in close, sandbags stacked high, but never quite enough to stop the rain of bullets. Rats scurry between the bodies and gnaw at the scraps of bread left behind. The air is thick with smoke, unwashed skin, and the sour tang of something dead that never goes away. You breathe it in because there's no choice. This becomes your world, day after day, week after week, with no end in sight. And in that world, strange things begin to happen. The first thing most men noticed wasn't a ghostly figure or a shadowy hand. It was sound. Footsteps on the duckboards late at night when no one was there. Voices whispering names in the dark. The creak of gear when the trench was empty. At first they blamed nerves or exhaustion. The human mind is easy to trick when it's starved of sleep, when every sound could be the last warning before death. But the stories repeated themselves too often, in too many places, to be brushed off completely. French soldiers spoke of footsteps pacing above their dugouts, as if an unseen guard was walking the line. A British officer told of a lone soldier standing silently at the end of the trench, uniform shredded, head bowed, and when he approached the figure, it dissolved into the night air. Death was everywhere. It came suddenly, without pattern or pause, and it blurred the line between the living and the dead. One moment a man was joking with his mates, the next his body lay twisted in the mud. For those left behind, it felt as if the dead hadn't gone far. Many soldiers believed their fallen comrades lingered, walking with them in the shadows, guiding or warning them of danger. Others whispered of darker presences, things that pressed on their chests at night, that drove them toward madness with whispers they couldn't understand. A Canadian infantryman claimed that, after a shell buried him in a crater, he saw a figure crawling toward him. Relief surged through him. He thought he was saved. But as the figure came closer, he saw half its face was gone, its body torn apart. He blacked out from terror, and when he came to, he was alone. Stories like this spread quickly through the trenches. They were traded like secrets, half warning, half confession. Some men shared them to pass time or to make sense of what couldn't be explained. Others spoke in whispers, fearing to even admit what they'd seen. Over time, certain trenches were branded as cursed. New recruits were warned not to linger in specific dugouts where too many had died, or where strange noises carried through the night. Some swore they saw phantom patrols moving in the distance, whole squads of soldiers silently crossing no man's land with stiff, unnatural movements, vanishing into the mist before they reached the wire. These tales weren't just idle talk. They were survival, a way to cope with the crushing pressure of life on the front. What made these accounts more unnerving was how often they were shared by groups, not just lone individuals. During one lull in fighting, an entire British platoon swore they saw a column of soldiers moving across the field. At first, they thought reinforcements had come. As the shapes drew nearer, the men realized the soldiers made no sound. Their boots left no prints, their uniforms looked worn from another time, and when the fog thickened, the figures simply faded away. Later, when the men compared what they'd seen, their descriptions matched almost perfectly. Some believed they had witnessed the spirits of soldiers from an earlier battle, still marching through a war that never ended. The officers tried to explain these sightings away. They spoke of exhaustion, nerves, and the tricks of artillery fire lighting up the night sky. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was barely understood, but it was a convenient label to slap on any story that strayed too far from reality. Still, the reports mounted. Men with no connection to each other, serving in different armies and on different fronts, described the same things. Ghostly hands pulling at boots, whispers that carried names through the fog faces of long-dead comrades, appearing only to vanish again. Even those who prided themselves on being level-headed began to wonder. The truth was that the trenches had become more than a battlefield. They were a borderland, a liminal place where the living and the dead pressed against each other. Soldiers felt the dead were close, closer than they'd ever been in ordinary life. They lived with death every day, and in that closeness, something else seemed to bleed through. For some, it was comforting, a sense that their brothers in arms were still nearby, still watching. For others, it was horrifying, proof that the war had twisted reality itself. This was the foundation of what would become some of the most famous stories of the war, the legends that would live long after the guns went silent, before the angels and phantom battalions became folklore, before the tales reached the newspapers back home. There were these raw, unfiltered moments, a whisper in the dark, a shadow at the end of a trench, a hand reaching up from the mud. For the men who lived them, they were not stories, but experiences etched into the very core of memory. And for those of us looking back, they are the first signs that the battlefields of the Great War were haunted in ways history can't quite measure. The stories spread quickly, because stories were sometimes the only thing that could cut through the endless monotony of mud, fear, and waiting. A soldier could not speak easily about his own terror, but he could pass along a tale he had heard, and in that retelling find a kind of relief. It was in this way that legends began to take shape, whispered in dugouts, carried from camp to camp, and eventually becoming part of the strange folklore of the Great War. The most famous of these was the Angel of Mons. The story first appeared in 1914 after the British Army had clashed with German forces near the Belgian town of Mons. The British were badly outnumbered, forced into retreat, and morale was sinking fast. Then came the rumors that as the troops pulled back, a shining figure appeared in the sky above them, spreading enormous wings of light. Some men swore it was an angel, guiding them to safety. Others spoke of ghostly medieval archers, long dead, loosing their arrows against the German lines. The details shifted depending on who told the tale, but the core remained the same. Something divine had intervened, shielding the British soldiers in their moment of greatest need. For the men at the front, the Angel of Mons was more than a story. It was hope. In the middle of mud and gas and death, hope was as precious as water. Some officers dismissed it as propaganda, a clever invention to keep men fighting. But those who swore they had seen the light in the sky held fast to their memory. For them, it was no invention. It was real, and it meant that heaven itself had not abandoned them. Other legends were darker, less comforting. During the Battle of the Somme, there were reports of an entire battalion of men seen advancing across no man's land. Soldiers on both sides saw them. At first they thought they were reinforcements, living, breathing men charging into the fray. But as the smoke cleared, the battalion simply faded, dissolving into mist as though they had never been there at all. Some claimed these were the ghosts of those who had died earlier in the same battle, reliving their final charge again and again. Others whispered that the dead had risen to fight alongside the living, unable to rest until the war was finished. Legends like these gave shape to the unexplainable. If a soldier saw a figure in the mist, was it easier to admit he'd imagined it, or to say he'd witnessed the phantom battalion? If a man heard whispers calling his name in the dark, was it madness, or was it the voices of fallen comrades, still lingering? For men on the edge of reason, the answer mattered less than the telling of the story. To speak it aloud gave it power, and in that power, there was both fear and a strange kind of comfort. In some trenches, tales of guardians spread. Men spoke of comrades who had been killed, yet seemed to reappear in dreams, warning their friends of incoming attacks. There were stories of ghostly figures leading patrols safely back through the dark, only for the soldiers to discover that no such guide had ever existed. These guardians were not always described in detail. Often it was just the sense of a presence, an invisible hand steering a soldier away from danger, a sudden certainty that saved a man's life. But the war also gave birth to darker tales. In some accounts, soldiers spoke of cursed ground, a certain stretch of trench where men always seemed to die, no matter how often it was rebuilt, no matter who was stationed there. Men claimed to see shadowy figures standing at the edges, watching silently, their faces hidden. Others swore that anyone who tried to sleep there woke to hands clutching at their boots, pulling them down toward the mud. These stories were neither printed in newspapers or passed along to families at home. They lived only in the whispers between men who had seen too much. The legends crossed borders, moving from one army to another. German soldiers spoke of the Feldgeister, field spirits who roamed the battlefields at night. Some claimed they were the souls of those who had died in the trenches, others that they were older beings, awakened by the violence of the war itself. Russian troops told of shadowy horsemen galloping across the steppe, appearing just before major battles, vanishing as suddenly as they came. The French spoke of the fantômes de guerre, spectral shapes moving in the smoke, sometimes leading them forward, sometimes luring them into danger. What is striking is how similar the stories were, despite the different languages, uniforms, and front lines. Whether British, French, German, or Russian, men told of glowing figures, phantom battalions, spectral guardians, and cursed trenches. It was as though the war itself had pulled something from the other side, a shared haunting that paid no mind to which flag a soldier fought under. And then there were the lights. Strange, floating lights that moved across the battlefield, too low to be flares, too silent to be lanterns. Some thought they were tricks of artillery fire, reflections in the smoke. Others swore they followed the lights and found themselves lost, wandering in circles as though the lights were luring them deeper into no man's land. A few insisted the lights saved them, appearing when they were disoriented in the dark and leading them back to their trench. These legends were repeated so often that they became part of trench culture, woven into the fabric of daily life. To some, they were entertainment, stories to pass the endless hours between bombardments. To others, they were warnings, things to be taken seriously. A trench marked as haunted might be avoided if men could manage it, though in truth there was no escaping death on the front. Yet even in the face of brutal reality, men still clung to their legends. They were not only stories of fear, but also stories of survival, proof that even in hell, there might be something watching, something beyond the mud and wire. Looking back, it is easy to dismiss these tales as myths born of trauma, as desperate men finding patterns in the chaos. But to the soldiers who told them, they were more than myths. They were lived experiences, moments burned into memory. In the retelling, the legends spread, taking on lives of their own. The Angel of Mons, the Phantom Battalion, the cursed trenches, they became the language of the haunted, the way men tried to explain the unexplainable. And as the war dragged on, these legends gave way to something more intimate and more disturbing. Not just tales whispered in groups, but personal accounts written in diaries and letters. Stories of brothers seen walking across the mud long after they had been buried, of voices calling men by name in the middle of the night, of ghostly hands pulling men down into the earth. These were not legends for the masses. These were private hauntings, confessions written in shaky script, often never shared until long after the war was done. And it is to those private accounts, the diaries of the damned, that the story now turns. If the legends gave soldiers something to cling to together, the diaries and letters revealed the raw truth private hauntings that most men could not speak aloud. These weren't stories meant to pass the time or boost morale. They were confessions written in the dark, scratched out on paper with trembling hands, accounts that often never reached anyone until long after the war had ended. They show us a side of the trenches that official histories leave out, where the boundary between memory, dream, and the supernatural blurred until no man could tell the difference. One letter from a young British soldier told of seeing his brother walking calmly across the mud. He ran to greet him, only to remember that his brother had been killed weeks before in another sector of the front. The vision left him shaken, uncertain whether he had seen a ghost or whether his grief had simply bent his mind. Another soldier, this one French, described how he awoke in the middle of the night to feel a hand clutching at his boot. He kicked, panicked, and called out, but when his lantern was lit, there was no one there. The other men in his dugout swore they had been asleep, yet all claimed to have heard the same scraping sound just before he shouted. The diaries are filled with small fragments like these, moments caught between fear and disbelief. A Canadian officer admitted that he sometimes saw men standing in no man's land during quiet nights, men who never moved, who simply stared toward the trenches with hollow eyes. When he raised his rifle, the figures faded into the mist, A German infantryman wrote about hearing his mother's voice calling to him across the battlefield, though she was hundreds of miles away. He said it was so clear, so real, that he wept openly in his dugout, too ashamed to tell anyone what he had heard. Not all accounts were terrifying. Some spoke of visions that felt protective, even kind. A Scottish soldier wrote that during one bombardment, he felt a hand press him down just before shrapnel tore overhead. He believed it was the spirit of a comrade who had been killed earlier that week, still watching over him. Another claimed he was guided back to his trench by a figure holding a lantern, only to discover later that no such lantern had been issued and no patrol had gone out that night. To the men who experienced them, these moments were proof that friendship and loyalty did not end with death. But for many others, the experiences were less comforting. Shell shock was barely understood at the time, and the human mind, under constant trauma, often twisted in unpredictable ways. Men wrote of hearing entire conversations outside their dugouts, only to find no one there. Some spoke of shadows that followed them, shapes that never quite took form but pressed in at the edges of vision. A few confessed to seeing the faces of the dead staring at them from the mud, eyes open, mouths moving as though trying to speak. These confessions were often written hurriedly, almost guiltily, as though the men feared being thought mad if anyone ever read their words. The silence around these stories was powerful. Soldiers rarely spoke of them to each other, fearing mockery or worse. To admit you had seen a ghost was to risk being labeled unstable, perhaps even unfit for duty. Yet the same stories appeared again and again in private writings. The repetition suggests something deeper than imagination. It suggests that the experience of the trenches, of living day and night surrounded by death, brought men to a place where ordinary boundaries no longer applied. In some diaries, the line between dream and waking life collapsed altogether. Men wrote of waking from nightmares only to find the figures from their dreams still standing beside their cots. One American volunteer recorded that after a particularly brutal gas attack, he dreamed of walking through a field where all the dead rose to march again. When he awoke, he swore he still heard their footsteps echoing in the distance. He was never able to decide if he had truly woken, or if the dream had followed him into daylight. For families who later read these diaries, the entries were often shocking. Many had expected tales of hardship, descriptions of mud, bullets, and bravery. Instead, they found accounts of shadows, visions, and voices that suggested their loved ones had lived in a world far stranger than they ever imagined. Some families destroyed the diaries, ashamed or unsettled by what they read. Others kept them hidden away, too personal, too haunted to share. Historians today debate whether these accounts were the product of stress and exhaustion, or whether they point to something more. From a medical perspective, hallucinations are understandable. Lack of sleep, poor diet, constant fear, and repeated trauma could warp anyone's perception. Yet the consistency of the stories and the similarity of accounts across nations has led some to wonder, how could so many men, separated by language, culture, and distance, all describe such similar experiences? Why did so many claim to see the same kinds of figures, hear the same whispers, feel the same hands pulling them toward the mud? Whatever the cause, the effect was real. These experiences stayed with the soldiers long after they left the front. Some wrote that even years later they still dreamed of ghostly figures, still heard the voices of comrades who never came home. Others confessed to moments when they swore they saw those same figures on city streets or in the fields back home, lingering at the edge of vision, as though they had followed them across the sea. The diaries make one thing clear. For many men, the war never truly ended. They brought the trenches back with them, carried inside their minds. The haunting was not confined to Belgium or France. It lived in memory, in nightmares, in the quiet hours when the world fell still. The ghosts did not leave when the war ended. They simply changed form, becoming private companions, shadows that only the veterans could see. This private haunting, hidden in diaries and letters, reveals the cost of the war in a way statistics never can. The millions of dead are numbers on a page. But these stories show the weight of carrying those deaths in your mind, of living day after day surrounded by the fallen until their presence becomes impossible to ignore. For those who lived it, the war was not only fought with rifles and shells. It was fought in the dark spaces of the mind, where whispers lingered and faces of the dead returned again and again. And even when the guns fell silent, the whispers did not. Subscribe for more real horror stories related to war narrated by U.S. soldiers. When the war finally ended and the men returned home, many hoped to leave the mud and terror behind. Yet peace did not silence the ghosts. For some, the end of the war only gave the hauntings more room to breathe. In the trenches, the soldiers had been too busy fighting to dwell for long on what they had seen. Back in quiet villages and crowded cities, there was space for memory to take root, and the dead followed them like shadows across their lives. Newspapers in the years after the armistice began to print strange little stories. A widow in London claimed her husband appeared at the foot of her bed the night he was killed in France, though the telegram had not yet arrived. A farmer in the American Midwest reported seeing his son standing in the fields, smiling only to remember he had been buried in Flanders. Mediums and spiritualists grew suddenly popular, offering seances where grieving families might hear the voices of their sons or brothers once more. The craze spread across Europe and America, fueled by a generation desperate for comfort, hungry to believe that the dead were not gone but waiting just beyond reach. For veterans, the experience was often darker. Nightmares plagued them, dreams where shells fell endlessly and the cries of the dying never ceased. Many described waking in a sweat to see figures at the edges of their rooms, outlines that dissolved when the light was lit. Some admitted to hearing the same whispers they had heard in the trenches, as though the battlefield itself had followed them home. These were not men prone to fantasy. They were laborers, farmers, clerks, men hardened by years of war. Yet their words suggest that the front had altered something fundamental in the way they perceived the world. Doctors called it shell shock, but that name never captured the full scope of what they endured. Shell shock explained trembling hands, fits of panic, sudden rage. It did not account for the visions, the voices, the persistent sense that the dead were never far away. The medical world tried to classify these experiences as symptoms, but for the men themselves, they felt like truths, terrifying, undeniable truths. One veteran wrote that he had come to believe the war had thinned the veil between the living and the dead. He said too much blood had soaked the earth, too many souls torn from their bodies at once, and that such violence could not help but leave scars on reality itself. Some communities whispered of cursed battlefields. Visitors to the Somme or Verdun reported unease, as though the ground itself was heavy with memory. Farmers plowing their fields sometimes uncovered bones, helmets, fragments of rifles, silent reminders that the war was never truly buried. Travelers spoke of strange silences, of birds refusing to sing in certain stretches of land. Even decades later, when memorials stood tall and tidy rows of white crosses lined the cemeteries, those who visited claimed to feel watched, to hear echoes that had no source. Writers and poets, many of them veterans, began to fold these hauntings into their work. They wrote of soldiers marching in endless lines beyond the horizon, of dead friends appearing in dreams to speak words of warning, of landscapes so soaked in grief they seemed alive. The literature of the post-war years is steeped in ghostliness, a quiet acknowledgement that the war had not only claimed lives, but had left the survivors dwelling in a half-lit world where the dead never quite let go. The legends, the diaries, and the post-war accounts all form a single thread. Whether the ghosts were real in the sense of spirits walking the earth, or whether they were born from the battered minds of men pushed beyond endurance, hardly matters now. What matters is that the soldiers believed in them, felt them, wrote them down with sincerity. In their own words, they testify that the war created an environment where the boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond grew thin, fragile, and uncertain. Even today, travelers to the old battlefields speak of unease. Tourists have reported hearing distant gunfire in places long silent, or seeing figures moving through the mist who vanish upon approach. Locals tell of strange lights drifting across the fields at night, unexplained sounds rising from the ground after rain. Whether these are echoes of memory, tricks of the mind, or something more, they continue the legacy of haunting that began over a century ago. What we know for certain is this: the men of the Great War lived among ghosts. Sometimes those ghosts comforted them, sometimes they terrified them, but always they reminded them of the immense weight of loss carried in those years. The war was fought not only with bullets and shells but in the minds and hearts of the men who endured it, a battle with unseen forces that did not end when the armistice was signed. The stories survive because they carry truth, even if not in the literal sense. They tell us how deeply the war scarred those who lived through it, how grief and trauma can blur the lines between the real and the unreal. They remind us that for millions of men, survival did not mean escape. It meant carrying ghosts for the rest of their lives, and perhaps that is why these tales endure, why they still captivate us more than a century later. They are not just stories of the supernatural. They are stories of memory, of longing, of the way human beings grapple with loss on a scale too vast to comprehend. The soldiers of the trenches left behind more than statistics and dates. They left whispers in diaries, shadows in letters, and legends that refuse to die. In the end, whether you believe the trenches were haunted, or whether you see the ghosts as fragments of weary minds, one truth remains. For those who lived through the Great War, the dead never truly left. They walked beside them in the mud, followed them across the ocean, and lingered in their homes for years after. And maybe in some quiet corners of Europe where the earth still holds the bones of the fallen, they linger still,